Howdy folks, welcome back to Mingles with Jingles, episode 43. Yes, it's the return of the Q&A series with the mighty Jingles, where 1,500 of you ask questions and I answer 3 of them. Well, you know, I do my best. Speaking of which, in last week's Mingles with Jingles, I did a frequently asked questions at the beginning, specifically talking mostly about how to submit replays to me. And I said that I vastly preferred if people would upload their replays to whatreplays.com and then email me a link to the replay. A number of you complained that it only supports people with EU World of Tanks accounts. This is true. So you have to make an EU World of Tanks account. Doesn't mean you have to download the EU client, doesn't mean you have to play on the EU server. All you have to do is register an EU account, and then you can start posting replays on whatreplays.com. Yeah, I probably should have said that last week. Anyway, let's crack straight on with the question. The first one this week, well, I'm attributing it to Eric Stephenson, although I've had this kind of question come from many, many Canadians just like him. He says, Jingles, I've got some questions for you. I might just be a mere Canadian subscriber. Those are his words, okay, not mine. You know, before all of Canada jumps all over me. What do you mean, mere Canadian? Right, these are his words. I might just be a mere Canadian subscriber, but I've never really heard you say much about Canada. I'm curious as to your thoughts on my country, as well as any experiences you've had with any Canadians, either while in service or as a civilian. Let me tell you about some Canadians, Eric. The first Canadian I ever met, I think I must have been 14 or 15 years old. It was when I lived in Swaziland and went to boarding school in South Africa. And her name was Roxanne Beckwith. She was the same age as me. She was in my class at school. We both lived in the same village in Swaziland, a place called Mflamanyati. And we both went to the same boarding school in South Africa, in a place called Barberton. And she was gorgeous. And she also had the hots for me. So, you know, that was nice. That was my first ever experience of anything Canadian. The next time I met anybody Canadian was about 20 years later, when we had a couple of Canadian contractors on board HMS Newcastle running trials on some new equipment that they were fitting. And they were nice guys. They were constantly pissed off with being mistaken for Americans, which I gather is a problem that Canadians get a lot. But, I don't particularly remember much about them. We invited them into our mess for a beer one night, and, they were great, but that's pretty much it. So, my actual personal experiences with Canadians is extremely limited. One smoking hot girl when I was a teenager, and a couple of technical contractors when I was in the Navy. That's pretty much it. However, I do read a lot. And I'm currently reading a whole series of books by the British historian called Max Hastings, specifically about the Second World War. The one that I've just finished reading is called Armageddon, and specifically about the Second World War 1944-1945 Northwestern European campaign, told from the perspective of German soldiers, Russian soldiers, British soldiers, Canadian soldiers, German civilians, prisoners of war, concentration camp victims. It's an amazing book, and there's one of the stories in particular is about a Canadian major called David Rogers. On the 26th of February 1944, the Canadian Cameron Highlanders were attacking in the Rhineland between Calcutta and Uden. The attack began in mud and darkness, and the Camerons in their vehicles found themselves under heavy fire. One of their company commanders, Major David Rogers, jumped down from his Kangaroo, which is a turretless Sherman used as an infantry carrier, and he ran into the nearest house defended by German paratroopers, which he cleared alone before his men reached him. He did the same with a second house, killing 4 of the enemy and capturing a dozen. He then returned to his battalion headquarters to report, and found the commanding officer dead, his intelligence officer severely wounded, and the position being sprayed by enemy automatic weapons. Major Rogers, accompanied only by his Batman, ran headlong across open ground to a house from which the Germans were firing, kicked open the door, and pressed the trigger of his Sten gun. It was empty. He then grabbed his pistol and started firing, wounding 2 Germans and causing the other occupants to surrender. He then went on to clear the rest of the house room by room, killing or wounding 9 Germans and capturing 12. He He then returned to assume temporary command of his battalion and toured each of its company positions on foot to ensure its security before he handed over to the unit second in command. For this morning's work, Rogers was recommended for a Victoria Cross, although all he received was a Distinguished Service Order. His Victoria Cross citation was actually approved at every level all the way up the chain of command until it got as far as 21st Army Group and passed across the desk of Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. And Montgomery himself crossed out the VC, changed it to a DSO, and awarded it on the spot. As commander of the 21st Army Group, Montgomery could actually award a DSO, whereas he couldn't award a VC. And this seems to have happened quite a lot. The more I read about the Canadian Army under the 21st Army Group in the Second World War, it just seems like the Canadians have a long and proud tradition of being nominated for Victoria Crosses and not getting them for one reason or another. I'll give you a couple of examples. Private Sidney John Cousins of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Late in the afternoon of the 22nd of July 1943, A Company of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry launched an attack on a hill to the left of Leonforte in Sicily. The Patricias were soon pinned down by heavy machine gun fire. Reinforcements arrived, one non-commissioned officer and two privates, one of whom was Private Cousins. Between the three of them they had a Bren light machine gun. They were ordered to knock out a German machine gun post, but the NCO and one of the privates were shot down within 25 feet of the objective. While the rest of the men of A Company watched in stunned disbelief, Private Cousins picked up the Bren gun, firing it from the hip, charged the machine gun post. Miraculously unhurt, he leaped among the Germans, killed all five of them. Then he reloaded the Bren gun and repeated the performance, charging another machine gun post and completely wiping it out. In the face of this attack, all the German resistance collapsed. Cousins should have won the Victoria Cross. He was recommended for it, but for some reason it didn't go through. And unfortunately, he was killed a short time later by, unbelievably, a Canadian artillery shell falling short. Because the lesser medals for which he qualified as a private couldn't be awarded posthumously, his only recognition came in the form of a mention in dispatches. He didn't even get a posthumous medal. Lieutenant Edward Perkins was a troop commander in the Lord Strathcona's Horse, part of the Royal Canadians, and he was recommended for the Victoria Cross during the crossing of the Melfa River on the 24th and 25th of May 1944. He led a reconnaissance troop of 3 Honey tanks. Right, technically these are tanks, but the Honeys were Stuart 5 light tanks without turrets, armed only with Browning 50 caliber machine guns. Led them across the Melfa River and held a position until a company of Westminsters could get across in support. The company, supported by Perkins' tanks, held on throughout the entire night in the face of furious German counterattacks. However, for this action, the Victoria Cross was awarded to an infantry officer of the Westminsters, who were only able to get across because Perkins' tanks got over there first, and some bureaucratic genius felt that 2 Victoria Crosses couldn't be awarded for the same action, so Perkins received a DSO. He was the only Armoured Corps subaltern to be recommended for the Victoria Cross during the entire Italian campaign, and he didn't get it. Then there's the story of Lieutenant Norman Alexander Ballard of the 48th Highlanders of Canada on the Liris River in Italy on the 17th of May 1944. The 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade was ordered to advance from the Pignataro area to the high ground overlooking Forme d'Aquino. The 48th Highlanders of Canada moved on the axis of the road with their left flank on the Liris River. Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment advanced on their right. D Company of the 48th Highlanders was leading the battalion, supported by a troop of Churchill tanks from C Squadron of 142 Regiment Royal Armoured Corps. 16 and 17 platoons of this company made contact with the Germans. The opposition was dealt with, but in the skirmish the number 38 wireless sets with both platoons were knocked out, and contact was lost with both the company commander and the tank troop commander. Despite this, the 2 platoons continued their advance. 16 platoon, commanded by Lieutenant Ballard, moved on the right of the road, and 17 platoon on the left. As they approached the battalion objective, Ballard's 16 platoon was fired on at close quarters by 75mm guns which were sighted on the high ground. 1 man was killed, another was wounded. Lieutenant Ballard immediately organised an assault on the position, sending 1 section up the right and himself leading a section forward on the left. Machine gun and rifle fire immediately broke out. The commander of the right section was wounded, and Lieutenant Ballard led his men directly against the 75mm gun positions. Throwing a grenade, he killed the crew of 4 men who were about to fire another round into his section. With another grenade, he killed several members of the protective infantry section of enemy infantry. Lieutenant Ballard was now completely unarmed, and he found a German officer pointing a pistol at him. Yelling at the top of his lungs, he launched himself at the German officer and with his bare fists beat him into submission, forcing him to drop his pistol and surrender. 9 of the enemy had been killed, 12 had been taken prisoner. They captured 3 75mm guns, 1 half-track and 1 machine gun. Lieutenant Ballard then consolidated his hard-won position. They held their ground against determined counterattacks by German tanks and infantry. In the meantime, the other 2 companies of the 48th Highlanders had become involved in very heavy fighting with a strong enemy position on the high ground to the right of Ballard's axis of advance. By nightfall, they still hadn't succeeded in dislodging the Germans. However, the Germans took so many casualties in their counterattacks on the position taken by Lieutenant Ballard that they were forced to withdraw, and the 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade was therefore able to follow up and pursue. Lieutenant Ballard was nominated for the Victoria Cross and was awarded, yep, you guessed it, the Distinguished Service Order. And there's more. Sergeant Clarence Crockett of the Calgary Highlanders at the Albert Canal in Belgium on the 22nd of September 1944 led a fighting patrol across the Albert Canal. He was actually suffering from dysentery at the time, but he assembled 8 men, armed them with automatic weapons. 2 of them had Bren guns, the remainder carried Stens. They also had a full complement of platoon equipment, a Piat, a 2-inch mortar and a 38 radio set. Instead of the normal Canadian combat boots which had steel hobnails, toe and heel plates, they were wearing canvas shoes, so that they would be more quiet, and they took as much ammunition as they could carry. Crockett was going to rely on stealth to get them across a damaged lock gate before the Germans could discover them. He briefed his men, telling them, if the flare goes up no matter where we are at, you get as low as you can and you don't move. Nobody fires until I tell you. There is a distinct possibility we're going to get caught on the lock gates. At 01:30 in the morning on the 22nd of September, Crockett left his company commander at the edge of the canal and moved off. He crossed halfway on his own, reaching a small island in the middle of the canal, then came back to lead the rest of the patrol. The canal was 90 feet wide. Corporal R.A. Harold followed behind him, and the patrol made it to a partially damaged stretch of lock gate. For the last 8 feet, only a single 6-inch pipe was available to cross on. Crockett left the patrol and edged across the wet pipe, slinging his weapon on his back and using a thin wire that the Germans had erected as a handrail. Reaching the north bank and finding a barrier of barbed wire, he returned to the patrol and brought them over. Harold and Crockett eased the barrier aside. The rest of C Company could only wait in silence and wonder what was happening. Crockett had decided not to radio word of his success so far for the fear that the Germans would hear his voice. Nonetheless, a flare suddenly went up, and Crockett heard a challenge in German. Some of the men were still on the pipe. German machine guns opened up, 1 of them was hit. The rest dived for cover on the north bank, the 2 NCOs directing them into tall grass. Then Crockett yelled in pure Western Canadian, "Give them shit!" and opened fire with his Sten, killing a sentry. He charged the German machine gun post and silenced it, then moved up with Private I.P. MacDonald, who fired 2 Piat rounds at a German machine gun position inside a house. Crockett then directed the fire of the 2-inch mortar until a 3rd German machine gun was knocked out. Private Harold gave first aid to the wounded Highlander as this was going on, and tended to 3 other men who had also been hit. He and Private Myers led them back over the canal. This left Crockett with only 3 other men on the north bank, and they were running out of ammunition. He ordered the radio man to send a request for assistance, but the radio man told him he'd lost the aerial. Crockett, I love the way this is phrased, it's so polite. Crockett shook the radio operator, impressed on him the importance of finding that bloody aerial, and then crawled around on his hands and knees with him under German fire until they found it in the grass. The remainder of Crockett's platoon, followed by the rest of C Company, then followed over the lock gate and established a bridgehead. By 04:20, 5th Brigade headquarters could be informed that an entire company had crossed the Albert Canal. The brigadier of the 5th Brigade recommended Crockett for a Victoria Cross. The recommendation was downgraded to a Distinguished Conduct Medal instead. Here's another one. Private Joseph Albert Bray of the 48th Highlanders of Canada at Casa Boschi in Italy on the 16th of December 1944. C Company of the 48th Highlanders of Canada were attacking a group of buildings known as Casa Boschi. Private Bray was a Bren gunner of the 14 Platoon in C Company. The position was strongly held, and enemy machine gun and rifle fire from the position was intense. In spite of this fire, Private Bray's section advanced steadily towards a brick shed from which the final assault on the objective was to be made. Before they reached the shed, the section came under small arms fire from the right flank. The section leader was wounded in the neck, and Private Bray himself was seriously wounded in the stomach by fire from an MP40 machine pistol. Despite his wounds, he immediately took charge of the section, rallied and organised them in a fire position, and himself attacked the enemy firing on him. He engaged and killed with his Bren gun 2 enemy armed with MP40 machine pistols. Having dispersed this post, he returned to the section near the shed. He'd hardly reached this spot when an enemy party, about 12 German infantry, did what the Germans do and counterattacked. Without hesitation, Private Bray moved back into the open and killed 2 of the advancing Germans and dispersed the rest. The enemy, having reorganised, again counterattacked, and again Private Bray, although wounded a second time by a bullet that broke his leg, continued his fire until the enemy had once more been driven off. It's probably no great exaggeration to say that despite being mortally wounded, Private Bray almost single-handedly took the position and then defended it against 2 counterattacks. He was nominated for the Victoria Cross, but he died of his wounds on the 30th of December 1944, without learning that he had instead been awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal. But it's not all bad news for Canada. Frederick George Topham, born on the 10th of August 1917, was a medical orderly and a corporal in the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, the Canadian Army, during the Second World War. On the 24th of March 1945, Corporal Topham parachuted with his battalion onto a strongly defended area east of the Rhine. At about 1100 hours, while treating casualties sustained in the drop, he heard a cry for help from a wounded man in the open. 2 medical orderlies from a field ambulance went out to the man in succession, but both were killed as they knelt beside the casualty. Without any hesitation, Corporal Topham went forward through intense fire to replace the orderlies that he'd just seen killed before his eyes. As he worked on the wounded man, he was himself shot through the nose. In spite of severe bleeding and intense pain, he never faltered in his task. Having completed immediate first aid, he carried the wounded man steadily and slowly back through continuous enemy fire to the shelter of a wood. During the next 2 hours, Corporal Topham refused all offers of medical help for his own wound, and he worked throughout this period to bring in wounded, showing a complete disregard for the heavy and accurate enemy fire. It was only when all casualties had been cleared that he allowed his own wound to be treated. He was immediately ordered to be evacuated, but he objected so strongly that he was allowed to return to duty. On his way back to his company, he came across a Bren carrier which had received a direct hit. Enemy mortar bombs were still dropping around, and the carrier was burning fiercely, and its own mortar ammunition was exploding. An officer on the spot had told everybody not to go anywhere near it. Corporal Topham, however, was made of sterner stuff, and immediately went out alone in spite of the exploding ammunition and enemy fire, and rescued the 3 occupants of the carrier. So, just to summarise this particular Victoria Cross citation, Corporal Topham of Toronto, Canada, unarmed, after being shot in the face, in excruciating pain for 6 hours, continually exposed himself to enemy fire with complete disregard for his own safety and well-being, and saved the lives of dozens of Canadian and British paratroopers. When that citation crossed his desk, not even Field Marshal Montgomery felt brave enough to downgrade it to a DSO. Corporal Topham got his Victoria Cross. So there you go, Canada. You had your moment of glory on Mingles with Jingles. I hope you're all happy now. You know, I just realised it took me 18 minutes to answer that question. Yeah, Canada, I bet you're sorry you asked now. Yeah, you better be careful the kind of questions you ask me, because you'll never hear the end of it. Actually, going back to the beginning of the question, when I mentioned the very first Canadian I ever knew was Roxanne Beckwith, a girl that I went to school with in South Africa. I've since looked her up on Facebook, purely because Eric asked this question. I thought, oh yeah, Roxanne Beckwith, you know, she's still drop dead gorgeous. Unbelievable. Why did I get old, fat, and lose all my hair, and she is still amazing? So thank you, Canada, for asking me about Canada, because otherwise I would have completely forgotten about Roxanne, and I would never have gotten in touch with her again. So yeah, that's one I owe you, Canada. Anyway, second question. Yep, that's right, 20 minutes into the video, second question. Nothing happens quickly around here. This is from Mark Hall. He's got a question about World of Tanks. He's just signed up for World of Tanks after watching my videos, and he's got his tier 1 tank sorted, but he's not very confident about going online in a multiplayer game. How did I do at the beginning, and did I get any nerves because I thought I'd suck? Oh dear. Mark, seriously, don't worry about it. Nobody expects you to be any good in a tier 1 machine. Right, I sucked for so... In fact, there are people that say I still suck now, and they're not entirely wrong. Everybody sucks when they start multiplayer gaming. It's the most cutthroat, competitive field of gaming that there is. But there's actually good news, because you've chosen to start multiplayer gaming with World of Tanks. And World of Tanks isn't like other... Well, technically it's a first-person or third-person shooter, because you're driving a tank. Right? Your reaction time in a tank is measured in seconds rather than the milliseconds that are required to be any good in a twitch shooter like Call of Duty, for example. If a target pops up from an unexpected direction and you're in a tank, it takes time to turn the turret around. It takes time to reload after you've fired your first shot. You've got time to think about what you're doing in World of Tanks in a way that you just don't in a normal first-person shooter. Now, having said all of that, you are still going to suck at first, but don't worry about it. Everybody sucks when they first start playing World of Tanks. I was dreadful, just really, really bad, up until around about when I first unlocked my first tier 9, which I think was the E75. And it probably took me around 6,000 or 7,000 games to get that far. And, you know, I was one of those guys who rushed in, and I don't think I had anything higher than tier 4, and I bought myself a Löwe, the German premium tier 8 heavy tank, and I was that hopelessly incompetent Löwe driver that you have on your team as your top tier heavy tank. Didn't have a clue, didn't have the faintest idea how the game mechanics worked, and I'm driving a tier 8 heavy tank. Please don't be that guy. Don't do what so many people do in World of Tanks. Flash their wallet and immediately rush out and buy a tank that they have no idea how to drive, and just suck so much in battles that they should not be in until they have at least 3,000 or 4,000 matches under their belt. I mean, I sucked so hard in the Löwe that even today my stats still haven't recovered from it, because that's the thing about your statistics in World of Tanks. Everybody's stats suck in tier 1, 2, 3 and 4. Well, not everybody, but the overwhelming majority of people suck in tiers 1, 2, 3 and 4. If you're going to start getting good at World of Tanks, it's probably going to happen from tier 5, maybe, usually tier 6, 7. By tier 8, if you're still shit at the game, by tier 8, you're probably never going to get any better. But it should take you a couple of thousand games to get there, and you should know by then whether or not you're enjoying it. And the thing about having sucky stats at tiers 1, 2, 3 and 4 is that it doesn't really matter, because everybody has sucky stats at tiers 1, 2, 3 and 4. Everybody, by the time they get to tier 5, 6, 7 and 8, their stats, if they're improving and getting any better at the game, your stats are still recovering from that long period of sucking in the lower tiers. Because the more games you play, the better you have to do to improve your stats, to make up for that colossal drag factor that everybody goes through when they're learning the game in the lower tiers. So, you know, even if you are getting better at the game, even if, you know, you've muddled your way through up to tier 5 and you've got the hang of it now, you've had some experience of fighting a whole range of different kind of tanks, you understand their weaknesses, you understand the strengths of the tanks that you're driving, and that certainly should be the case by the time you get to tier 5, if you're capable of getting good at the game. But what you shouldn't do is worry. You shouldn't fall into the trap of worrying about your stats when you're at tier 5 or 6. You will know, based on your own performance and understanding of your own performance, whether or not you are getting any better. You may very well be getting better, but your stats aren't going to get better until at least tier 8. because you sucked so hard in the couple of thousand games that it took you to get up to the stage where you finally started getting comfortable with the game. And that's why it's almost completely pointless worrying about the win rate, for example, of your teammates in a tier 5, 6, 7 or 8 game, because they're in exactly the same situation as you. A guy with a 46% win rate in a tier 7 tank who's played 4,000 games might be a good player. It's impossible to tell based on a global win rate at that earlier stage in the guy's World of Tanks career. His stats are still recovering, as yours will be, from that period of sucking for his first couple of thousand games in tiers 1, 2, 3 and 4. Now, of course, if you've got a 35% global win rate and you're driving a tier 6, 7 or 8 tank, then there's probably no hope for you. And by the same token, if you see somebody driving a tier 10 tank with a 46, 47% win rate, they're probably pretty bad as well. And then, there are other stats that people use to judge performance by, things like hit rating, average XP or average damage per battle, but these are all completely relative. Again, if you're down at tier 4 and below, a lot of the tanks have autocannons and horrible accuracy, and they just tend to spray and pray shots all over the place, the majority of which are going to miss. That doesn't mean that having a terrible hit rating means you're a bad player, it just means that you're using a lot of autocannons. Average damage and XP per battle as well. The amount of XP per battle is completely dependent on how much damage you've done. And if you're driving a tank that only does 57 damage per shot, but you have 300 average damage per battle, that's actually pretty good. 300 average damage per battle in tier 8, 9 and 10, on the other hand, is terrible. So, I guess the short version is, don't focus too much on your stats, other than using it as a yardstick to measure your own improvement, right? Stop comparing yourself to other players, because your situation is never going to be 100% the same as other players. If you feel that you are improving, and you can measure that improvement in your own stats, then that's good enough. And the only way you're going to get any better at the game is by jumping in and playing it, and learning how the game mechanics work, and learning the strengths and weaknesses of the tanks that you're driving. Play a whole different range of tanks so that you understand the strengths and weaknesses of the tanks that you're going to be coming across, and you can shortcut your way to a decent performance by watching YouTube videos, for example, like the ones that you have been watching here on my channel. But even then, there's a limit to how much book learning will take you. You really do need to just get in there and play the game and have fun, because you can sit here watching my videos or Quickie Baby's videos or anybody's videos, or have a look at the World of Tanks wiki page and read the battle mechanics and so on and so on and so on. Most of it is going to be meaningless to you, completely meaningless, until you actually start playing the game. So what you should probably do is just throw caution to the wind, get stuck in, play your tier 1 games, play your tier 2 games, play your tier 3 games, and then at that stage start reading up on the things that have prompted you to ask questions about what happened in a particular game, because at that stage you'll have the experience to actually understand what the World of Tanks wiki is telling you about the battle mechanics. You'll then be in a position to understand some of the finer details that I talk about in some of my videos. And I do recommend my videos if you're new to the game. Countless people have said that the kind of information that I present is really more geared at newbies. Once you've achieved a certain skill level in the game, my videos become much less informative and much more entertaining. People like Quickie Baby, for example, people who are already good at the game, get a lot more out of watching Quickie Baby's videos, certainly from an informational point of view, because he's just so much better a player than I am. But for the moment, certainly at first, all you want to do is just get in there and play the game, and don't worry about sucking. Tiers 1, 2, 3 and 4, everybody sucks. If you suck, well, better or worse than anybody else. It's expected of you that early in your progress in the game. Get in there, drive your tank, learn by doing. And it's very important that you do learn by doing, because if you're doing something in World of Tanks and it's not working, don't be one of those guys that keeps repeating the same noob mistake all the way up to tier 10. If something isn't working for you, find out why it isn't working. There's all sorts of information available on the internet, not just the World of Tanks wiki or my YouTube channel. Be the guy who wants to find out why things aren't working for him. Don't be the guy who keeps repeating the same mistakes over and over again and then rages that the game is crap. Do that, you will get better, your stats will recover from your initial sucky period in tiers 1 to 4, and you'll have a lot more fun playing the game as well. Well, that's got to be a new record. 30 minutes in and I've only answered 2 questions. Well, we're almost done. There's just time for one more thing. That's right, it's time for this week's roundup of losers, window lickers and oxygen thieves, starting off with a new entry, this Object 704, who clearly what are you doing in the AMX 1375, seriously? In a bush, what are you trying to do, spot? Anybody would think you were a scout. Clearly you're going to have to be punished for trying to do your job. Oh snap, wouldn't you know it? Just after you've unloaded your gun into the back of a friendly AMX 75, enemy tanks turn up, and you have to sit there and watch the AMX obliterating this enemy tank while you can't do anything about it because your gun's reloading. So is there any chance at all this Object 704 is going to do some damage to the enemy team? Nah, of course not. Next up, it's a group entry from the 2 slaptards in the B1 and the T1 Heavy on Heiniko's team, here as he's fighting his heart out and Prokhorovka. We're 3 minutes into the game and those ass clowns haven't moved for the last 2 of them. Less than 7 minutes of the game remaining, Heiniko is on 16 health, can't afford to take another hit. He's having to proximity detect the remaining enemy tanks so artillery can kill them for him. Meanwhile, Herp and Derp, well, Herp in the T1 Heavy is still camping in the same bush. Derp in the B1, he has actually moved. He's moved backwards. He's moved away from the enemy tanks. That's right, they're not AFK, they're just incredibly shit. With less than 5 minutes of the game remaining, and despite the Herculean efforts of Heiniko and the friendly artillery, Heiniko now has the full attention of the remainder of the enemy team. Surely now Herp and Derp will make their move. Nah, don't be silly. They're idiots, of course they're not going to make a move. I mean seriously, look at this. This clown shoe can't even camp in the bush properly. He's been sitting there for 12.5 minutes and he can't even do that right. Half of his tank is sticking out. And as for this reject from the Afterbirth bucket, if he was any further to the rear of the map, he'd be on El Halouf. Yep, these 2 brainless idiots were so incapable of thinking and breathing at the same time that eventually artillery had to go forward to try to scout out enemy positions. Although the ultimate insult probably has to be that these 2 cockstowns couldn't even lose efficiently. Nothing says you suck more than boring a game out to a 15-minute long draw. The clear winner of this week's Wanker of the Week award goes to the utter cock goblet in the T43 on Peterbrood's team here in this Live Oaks map. Now, I am not a massive fan of capping the flag just for the sake of capping the flag. However, in this occasion, there are still 3 very dangerous tanks on the enemy team, tanks that between them are responsible for 3/4 of the enemy team's kills. They can still lose this match. Capping in these circumstances is probably a wise thing to do. Unfortunately, our friend in the T43 doesn't appear to agree, and while I sympathise, there is absolutely no excuse to start team killing the guys in the cap circle. The orgy of self-destruction that followed directly because of that team kill mean that this T29 has to deal with 3 enemy tanks practically alone as everybody behind him starts shooting each other. Even artillery starts trying to kill this cocksucker in the T43. It very nearly costs them the match. The T43 driver is not a bad player, he's just a colossal douchebag. In fact, the only good thing that came out of this was that they ended up winning by the skin of their teeth, and that cocksucker ended up getting his tank blown out from underneath him. And as a lucky and completely coincidental side effect, is about to become very famous on YouTube. That's it for this week, folks. See you next Monday, and take care.